Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early-stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, we interview Alberto Savoia. Alberto was Google's first engineering director and the author of The Right It, Why So Many Ideas Fail and How to Make Sure Yours Succeed. He also coined the term Pretotyping and has influenced my thinking over the years and has been connected to some of our previous guests, such as Pat Copeland, who authored a white paper with Alberto many years ago. You may not know this, but I actually quoted Alberto in the Testing Business Ideas book for his Pretend to Own experiment. Over the course of this episode, we basically geek out over testing in general as two of the premier minds on the subject. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Alberto.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad that we can finally sit down and chat together. I've been a huge fan of yours for so long. I think the first time I became aware of you was a Google Talk where you may or may not have walked out on stage dressed as the Grim Reaper, talking about The Right It, and all of that. And so I've been a fan ever since. And I'd love for you to share some of your background.
Yeah, there was a bit of an infamous stunt that was at the Google testing conference. Now, it's not testing product idea, it was just testing software. And I went out to give a talk called Test is Dead, which was quite controversial. So, the video is still there and you see, half haters, half lovers. But essentially, I hate to say, but I was right. The QA discipline, the way it was done before, has dramatically changed in the past 10 years. But I suspect it's going to change again with AI, because with AI, writing code is much easier than testing code and making sure that the code does the right thing. So I think in a just brief time of 10, 12 years, it's going to go flip back again to, to actually human being testing to see what the computer does. So it's fascinating, so it's like a Lazarus of testing. Test is dead, long-live testing. Very fascinating. But that's a different type of testing than the one we're talking.
True. Yeah. The first time I think our paths feel like they cross a lot in online world, although we've never really sat down and chatted before. So I'm excited about this. But I actually asked you to be a little piece of the book I wrote, Testing Business Ideas, because of your Pretend to Own story that resonated so well to me, and you graciously accepted. And so I feel like ever since then, I've just been watching what you're writing and what you're speaking about, and just a huge fan of what you're doing.
Thank you. And vice versa, I'm a fan of yours. And you know who brought us together? Pat Copeland, because Patrick was my boss at Google. Patrick is the one that one day he wrote me in and said, Alberto, I need you to volunteer for something. I said, what? I said, you have to be part of this, an innovation task force. I said, innovation task force? I'm trying to do other stuff. I said, well, please do it for me. Because I asked Patrick and Patrick didn't want to do it. So he kind of put it in my lap. So as it happens with most task force, I think I was the only one who did any tasks or had any force. And as part of that innovation, we studied, how can Google be more innovative? And what are the problems with innovation? And one of the things that came out is that, we can build stuff, but so many times we build the wrong thing, right? So if you go and look at the history of Google, right? Remember Google Wave was supposed to be, the evolution of Gmail, kind of Google Glass, although that was actually an experiment. But there were many Google products. In fact, if you go online and you look for, Google Graveyard, you find that there's far more failed products than products that succeeded. It's like a 10-to-1 ratio. So I started studying the problem. And because I was, an engineer and a director of engineering myself, I realized, Alberto, I spent 80% of my life building great products, testing them, making sure that they work great, that nobody ever used. So I kind of came up with this slogan one day: make sure you're building the right it before you build it right. Because I know we can build stuff, but most of the time we end up building the wrong stuff, as you well know, and as you well teach. So it's funny, I shifted my career. I said, look, I know how to build stuff. The real challenge is, how do I make sure I build the right stuff? So I thought, can I apply the scientific method and my engineering approach to identifying and figuring out which products are going to work before be successful before I go and sell them. In other words, to use your language and my language, I focus on testing desirability because that is the missing ingredient, right? Feasibility, can we build it? The answer to that is yes, 90% of the time. Viability, can we make a viable, sustainable, long-lasting business out of it? The answer is yes, most of the time, because I have a slogan, if there is a market, there is a way, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe, in 5 years. That's how I got into it. And one day I thought, prototyping, I talked to Tim, said, you have to build a prototype. And then they came back and said, well, yeah, it's going to take us about 6 months. I said, no, can you do something in like 6 weeks, 6 days? I said, no, that's not a prototype. So I thought, we need something before that. So I called it pretotyping. So I rushed to write on Google search, is anybody else using this word? Because it's pretty cool. So just misspelled on some pages. And so I decided, good, it's mine. And so I decided, hey, everybody's allowed to coin one neologism in their life, and this is going to be mine. So I came up with pretotyping. 90% of the people love it, 10% of the people hate it. They think it's not needed, but I like it and I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I mean, I think that's still true today with feasibility. I do very few experiments around feasibility. I still try to walk my clients through feasibility risk, but they already know that world. Most of my focus is on desirability and viability, because even if people want it, you still have to find a way to make money with it eventually. And that's why I get pulled into business modeling and all of that. But I would say most of my coaching and consulting now is almost all desirability and viability. The companies I coach can build anything.
That's right. Somebody comes to me, hey, Alberto, I have a time machine. Can you help me, test the desirability? I said, well, first make sure that it works. In a way, that's where your work and mine are slightly different, right? I'm super concentrated, in fact, exclusively on desirability. That's what the pretotyping part. And because most of the time, the companies I work with, they're great at executing, right? So I figure out that they can figure it out. But you're right. A lot of the time, especially if you work with entrepreneurs and not with experienced companies, they have an idea and then they can't figure out how to make any money with it. Right. So you're right. Desirability without viability is a problem, right? It's called a success disaster, right? People want my product and I lose, $10 on every sale.
Yeah. I think our work is very similar. I remember when I asked for the pretend to own to be included in testing business ideas, I was thinking, well, I can't. So we had a professional illustrator named Owen Pomry hand draw every experiment. And I was like, I can't have the wooden block with the chopstick as far as a drawing. I need to find another drawing. So this illustrator, I said, hey, this is what I'm talking about. And I pointed him to kind of some of your work too. And I said, can you just come up with a drawing that represents this? And he ended up drawing this sort of like fake dog. It was like a dog. It was cardboard and you put a leash on it and drag it around. And it actually, I kind of really enjoyed it. So it made it into the book. But for those of you, I guess for those listeners who don't know what a pretend to own is, can you maybe just expand upon that a bit and how you use it with your work?
Sure. So pretend to own is a type of pretotypes, right? So just like if you have in your book, which I think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And as I said before, with the perfect title that I wish I had thought of that title first, How to Test Business Ideas. So there are many techniques and I call them pretotyping, and the pretend to own is one. Essentially, it's to test desirability, but at a very personal level. Because many times, I'm sure it has happened to you, you work with companies that they build products and they say, well, I'm not going to use it, but for sure somebody's going to use it. In software engineering, there are many tools that I work and say, well, I would never use this. I would just use, a VI or just like, text edit. But I'm going to build this very sophisticated text editor. So the product in question is the Palm Pilot. If you're our age, you probably remember when it came out, it was the hottest thing ever. And Jeff Hawkins, super bright guy, right? So his product before the Palm Pilot was called the Grid Pad. So the Grid Pad was the very first iteration of what today, is an iPad. So genius level guy. He spent years developing and building the Grid Pad. And as Time magazine said, it was an engineering marvel, but a market disaster. Okay. So the Grid Pad did a lot of things, but it turned out it was too big, too cumbersome, tried to do too much. So it was a failure. So here you have a very smart person, Jeff Hawkins, and a very talented team investing years to build a product that did exactly what it was supposed to do and that nobody used or bought. Okay. So after licking his wounds from that failure, he thought, well, what can I do next? Why did this product fail? And he realized, well, maybe it was too big, because it really was as heavy as a brick and the size of a hardback book. What if I put something I can actually put in my pocket? So he thought, well, I know I can build it, but I'm not stupid. I'm not going to repeat the same mistake, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, fool me once, shame on you. So he said, I'm going to build, he went to his garage. He got a block of wood about the size of a pack of cards, or actually the size of today's iPhone. A block of wood, he put some paper sleeves on it. And on the paper sleeves, he drew a user interface, right? That had a square where you had the text. And then remember, he had this way of writing called graffiti, right? Which, if you want to write an A, you do like a little triangle. And it was actually very easy to learn. I can still write in graffiti to this day. But before he built all the hardware of that, he just went around with this block of wood pretending that it was working to see if we would actually use it. So he would pull it out of his pocket, and if I can pretend that now I'm Jeff Hawkins, say, hey, David, why don't we schedule lunch next week? Does Thursday work for you? You say, yes. So he pulls out this block of wood with a paper interface, a toothpick, and it kind of clicks where you would do to schedule a meeting. And after doing that for a week or so, he learned, right, the valuable lesson. You do prototypes and experiments to learn. So what did he learn? Yes, if it's this size, I would carry with me all the time. 2, I would only use it for 4 things 90% of the time. Appointment books, to-do lists, a little notepad, and a calendar. So he just built something very small with those features, and it turned out to be a success, and it's the predecessor to today's smartphone.
Amazing. Yeah, I love that story. It almost feels as if people would skip that step and say, well, why do all that work? I'll just go and build the whole thing. But it sounds like he learned quite a bit from just the experience of carrying it around, that he may have missed some of that nuance of the 4 types of things if he hadn't have done that.
That's right. And I have a theory as to why people do not do this more often, right? Because it's so logical. By the way, the first thing that I think I write in my book, chapter 1, the law of failure, which states most new products will fail in the market, which everybody understands. So that's the first punch. The second punch is even if competently executed. So competent execution, I mean, you built it well, it works great. That doesn't matter if there is no market for that product. So people know that most products fail in the market, and yet they still build the product and then they try to sell it. And after a while, I thought, I finally figured out why that is. It's a fear of rejection, right? So I kind of compare it to, fear or romantic rejection, right? You just like you are afraid to go and ask, somebody out on a date, or you want to be perfect. Say, well, after I buy a new dress and I look good and, I can put some perfume, I can go and do it. They want to have the perfect product before they go and approach the market. And, that's very hard to do, because the market may reject you. So they use that as an excuse to procrastinate. And I'm going to build it. I'm going to add this bell. So I'm going to add this whistle. And then eventually they bring it to the market. They think it's perfect. And then it kind of backfires. That's my theory on the psychology, right? Because we're logical. Human beings are supposed to be logical, but some things are psychological. So the logic is, of course, you test if there is a market. Because, to use your language, right, you do a risk assessment. So let's test this hypothesis first. Most people know, will people buy it is the riskiest hypothesis. And yet they ignore it. So they're not being logical, but they're being psychological. And a lot of time, in fact, a lot of my work, I emphasize psychology over logic. Human beings are not as logical as we would like them to think.
Yeah, I think that resonates too. I think there's so many ways that plays out in the experimentation process. Everything from we're taking a really long time to run this experiment, or we're taking a really long time to analyze the results into insights to drive to action, or we set the criteria so low that we just kind of hop over it and check the box and say, yep, ran a test. There are all these different ways that plays out. But I think you're right. It comes back to we don't want to be wrong. We don't want to be rejected. And therefore, we'll sort of manufacture these scenarios where we don't really have to face that. We'd almost rather face we spent millions of dollars and launched it and then it flopped versus the other rejections along the way.
That's exactly. We like to live in Thoughtland, right? So in Thoughtland, as long as the product exists only in imagination and the market exists only in imagination, you cannot fail, right? So this is the same of, the singer-songwriter that never performs in public, but, it's taking time to put together his amazing album, of 10 songs. There is no failure in your own mind. When you bring it in the real world, the chance of failure is very real. And that's why I think most people live in what I call Thoughtland with their idea.
Yeah, and you mentioned the risk ranking and looking at hypotheses. I want to get your take on hypotheses for this because I do sense some confusion out there in the market. I also sense confusion in people I coach. I think early on in my career, I used assumption and hypothesis sort of interchangeably. And over time, I've sort of clarified my stance a bit saying, yeah, an assumption is something that would, you think it's true, but there's no proof. Whereas a hypothesis is sort of like a working assumption where I use the words, and Alex Osterwalder and I do this too, where it's like testable, precise, and discrete. And then we try to refine something because sometimes it's like, yeah, will they buy it? But how do you test will they buy it? It's like, who's they and how much and what's it? And we ask all these questions, but you have a specific format for the way you teach hypotheses. And I just wanted to dig into that a little bit. So like, how do you approach framing a hypothesis?
It's funny because the words you use are exactly what I use. So here's how the X was the hypothesis. That's what I call it. At the time, I was teaching this course on innovation and creativity at Stanford with Tina Seelig, great professor of creativity and innovation. And I had office hours, right? So, and in office hours, students came to pitch their ideas. And I remember the most memorable ideas, we even did some video about it, was the challenge was, how do you reduce food waste on campus? And one of the ideas was second day sushi. And the idea is that, just as sushi is about to expire, right? There is a 24-hour window where it may not taste fresh, but it's not yet going to kill you. So the idea is that, hey, students have a strong stomach. So, if we take the sushi and, because it's about to expire, instead of throwing it away, we sell it at half the price. Some people will buy it. And when they explain the idea, they use, as you said, who are these people? What are these words? They said, well, lots of people would buy second day sushi if it's cheap enough. And I said, well, who are these people? What is cheap enough? So what are all these details? So two expressions that I learned at Google: data beats opinion and say it with numbers. I was doing these office hours, and on this board, it was in the engineering building, some kind of math class or engineering class, they left some equations, right? Some differential equations. So I saw, look at X, Y, and Z, and I thought, wait, I know how to get to these people. So I raised the board and I wrote, at least X% of Y will do Z, right? And X, Y, and Z, remember from your high school algebra, they're unknown variables. And that's exactly what you're dealing with, right? So you're dealing with an unknown product, an unknown market, an unknown price that will actually work. So that day, I even asked the student, can you please take a photo of me and the whiteboard? Because I thought, I suspect this is a very good idea. And in fact, right now, when I can teach something, I just teach people the XYZ hypothesis. And I also teach it to entrepreneurs. I said, look, you have to do an elevator pitch, right? So, I taught some entrepreneurship classes, and we have these things where, students come to you, a team has 5 minutes with you. And I said, when am I going to teach you? I said, just the XYZ hypothesis. So imagine you have an idea, and then you have to kind of wave your hands and explain the idea to some people. But here's my idea. At least 20% of students that want to buy sushi will buy second day sushi if it's half the price, right? So it's very clear, 20% of your target market, sushi buying students, and you have a price target, which also kind of gives you an idea of the size of the opportunity, how big the business is. So I started teaching that, and it caught on, not just with entrepreneurs, also kind of CEO. Some people said, damn, I got this Harvard MBA. Nobody ever taught me something this simple. They just come with this 40-page business plans. And this one explains it in 1 second. Whatever idea you have, if you need to communicate to anybody or a VC, if you give them the XYZ hypothesis, at least 30% of people who use taxis will use a Waymo, if it's priced, less than 20% more than the taxi. And then you know what the size of the taxi market is, what the price is. It's a very clear way of explaining your idea.
Yeah, I like that. One of my first big engagements in San Francisco was a travel company, and the whole travel company is based on the idea of you'll buy a room if it's discounted enough, So we had to have these hypotheses of, well, what's that rate and who's the target and what are they going to convert at, what percentage, all that. And so that really resonates with me. So you're kind of using XYZ to focus, it feels like, or help them refine what they're trying to say in a way where they could go test it.
That's right. It accomplishes several purposes. First of all, if you have multiple people in a group, the moment you put numbers to it, you realize the differences. So I had another team that said they had an idea for a portable air quality monitor, right? So, if you live in a very polluted city like, Beijing, the air quality can get horrific. And if you have kids, you have to be careful. So they thought, well, if it's reasonably priced, et cetera, et cetera. When I asked them to write the XYZ hypothesis, I realized that for one of the team members, reasonably priced meant $100 or less. For another one was about $200. So just the fact of saying it with numbers, they said, what do you mean $100 or less? We cannot build it for less than $100. And the other guy said, well, what do you mean $200? Nobody's going to pay this for $200. So that's the first thing it accomplishes. Second, it's a great communicator, right? If you say 5% of parents who live in highly polluted cities will buy a personal air quality monitor for, let's assume they agreed on $150. You also have an idea of the size of the market. And finally, it comes to what you and I are kind of famous for. It is designed to be tested, right? The job of a hypothesis is to be tested, right? It doesn't exist there in isolation. If you have the hypothesis, you got to test it. So you have all of the parameters. So if it's true that 20% of the people who live in Beijing and who have children will spend $150 for a portable air quality monitor, how can we test it? And there, what do? You test with everyone in Beijing, which is like 10 million people or more? No, you zoom in. So I call my next step is called hypothesis zooming, right? So 20% of people who live in polluted city. I said, but where are you now? Well, I'm in Beijing. So 20% of the people in Beijing. Where in Beijing are you now? This district. So in this district, is there a place in this district where there are parents that, well, my kids go to a school and there's 1,000 parents and there, so there's about 1,000 kids that, perfect. So you zoom in from the entire planet of all the polluted city to Beijing to a particular school in Beijing. So run your test there. Because, right, just like when they tested the fact that gravity could bend light, right, the effect of gravitation in space, that applied to the entire universe. Yes, gravity, bends space, but they couldn't test the whole universe. So what did they do? They waited, remember, for kind of an eclipse where, the position of a star, and when, eclipse was at the right point, they were able, by just looking at one star, that it deflected by the predicted amount. And so by doing this very small focus experiment, they validated a hypothesis. So hypotheses make predictions. And if your test validates those predictions, then that's a very strong signal that your hypothesis may be correct. Of course, you don't judge on one test, but...
I like that. I like how it gives you the ability to run multiple tests to ultimately prove or disprove or refute or support or validate, invalidate, whatever language you're going to use with that hypothesis. I do like zooming in. I once worked at a company that was founded by this guy named Majid from MIT. And he kept talking about how we zoom in, how we use statistics and use all that. And he said, if you don't believe in this, next time you go in to the doctor and they're testing your blood, have them take all of it just to be sure. And that really stuck with me all these years. I was like,
use it. Yeah,
just take all my blood just to make sure that, we already have this. So I'm a huge fan of your book, The Right It. And I know you use a lot of this in your own work. We're very alike that way, where we don't just espouse these methods and tell other people to do them and then don't follow themselves. We use them in a lot of our own work. I used a lot of these techniques in creating my book. I'd love for you to share, some of the ways you've used this in your own work with your own book. How did you prototype your way through it? What did you learn? I would love just any insights you can share on that process.
Yeah, no, I love it too because it's very meta, right? So I prototyped a book about prototyping. Okay. So when I was at Google about 2011, I came up with this word prototyping, and I kind of put some of the concept together. And I wanted to write a little booklet to use in-house with various prototyping techniques. We kind of mentioned one, right? We took the pretend to own. There are some the fake door, the facade, the mechanical Turk. There's a whole list of them. But I thought I knew right? Everybody knows most books fail in the market, okay? Since you wrote a book, you know how much damn work it is. It's very hard. It's no fun. You're there alone. The feedback takes months before it's published or a year before you get it. So it's really drudgery. So I thought, I'm not going to go through the drudgery unless I know that there's a market for my book. So I thought, well, perfect. I'm going to write a prototype book about prototyping, which is very meta. So I talked to my boss, Pat Copeland, great, best boss I ever had. That was one of your previous podcasts.
Yes, on Amazon Dash Button. He was amazing.
Yeah, he's great. He's a great guy. Lot of fun. We've shared the office and we always had a lot of fun. So I said, okay, Alberto, I give you 1 week to write this, right? Because this, I don't want it to be a junket, so you disappear for 3 months on a sabbatical. So I thought, okay, I have 1 week. I rented, one of the first Airbnb was an Airstream near California, here near Big Sur. And I said, okay, no internet, nothing. I'm going to give myself 1 week to write. And however long I write in 1 week, that's going to be the book. So it turned out to be 72 pages. The editor was our tech administrator in the office. So thank you, Diana, right? So I gave it to her. She was very good and, found a lot of little typos. So this 72-page booklet, I put it online, internally at Google. And then I went and printed some hard copies, and folded them and stapled them myself in a little booklet. And I started giving them away. And kind of caught on, and people kept asking me for it. So eventually it escaped the Google firewall and ended up at Stanford. And so people at Stanford started to ask me can you come and give talks about it? To make a long story short, eventually I don't know how many copies have been printed or read illegal because I didn't protect it or anything. But I know there are a lot of translations in all sorts of languages. Some people asked me for permission. Other people just simply translated it. And so I said, hey, Alberto, your book has been translated, in Portuguese. I said, well, I didn't know that, but that's great. Good for them, right? I mean, Google paid for it. So when that happened and people are going to like this book. They like the way I write it. So now it's time to write a proper book because I validated the desirability. People love the idea. They share it with other people. They ask me for more examples. And so at that point, it made it very easy to go to a publisher. And that's the next step, right? So this desirability, am I able to get an advance from the publisher that means that they're interested enough? So that actually worked out very well. And I also gave them the evidence. I can write. People are reading it because they saw all these translations. I said, well, this is better than we have for most books. And so then I invested the 9 months it took to write the book, and I've never had to give birth to a baby, but, giving birth to a book, it's probably painful in very different ways. But yeah, it was really, it's a lot of lonely work. So, but I'm glad I tested it.
I am too. I think I have, in 2011, you had a second version of the PDF. I don't know how I came across it. It might have been from one of your talks or something you posted. But I have that version from 2011, which at the time was still very insightful. I mean, you were onto things that, the lean startup movement was just getting going. And there were a lot of these things circling together. I felt like we had your work, we had work from Eric Ries and Lean Startup, we had work from my co-author Alex Osterwalder with the Canvas and the business model Canvas, all that stuff started like swirling around this problem we had, which was we're launching stuff that nobody wants. Like we have to fix this.
And the granddad is Steve Blank, right? Steve Blank.
Oh yes, and Steve as well.
I did wrong. But here's the interesting thing, just like with the Newton and Leibniz, right? We kind of arrived at these things independently. So I was like 6 months into prototyping and that stuff that somebody said, hey, have you heard about the Lean Startup? I hadn't heard about it, right? But I thought, great, right? When two people reach the same conclusion, if we invent calculus at the same time, it means that, and it works. That's a very good sign. That's kind of the genesis. But also in personal life, I prototype. Some interesting story. My daughter, right? She's being my daughter. She likes to, most of the time kids don't do what their parents say, but, she believes that prototyping is right. So she lived in Berkeley at the time with her boyfriend in a 2-bedroom apartment, and she wanted to move to San Francisco. And she thought, but in San Francisco, they could not afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So she thought, well, can we live in a 1-bedroom apartment, right? How do we organize? So she prototyped it. She was in Berkeley still. They lock one room, right? put all the furniture that they couldn't use. And so they prototype living in one bedroom for 1 month, which is kind of silly when they explain to their friends. They said, no problem doing this. So yeah, I try to prototype a lot of things because not just with new products, as you probably, a lot of time, people buy $300,000 sailboat and then they realize, I don't like sailing that much. Just to have an extreme example.
Yeah, I think it's a good example because I think early on, well, maybe even still today a bit, people feel this only applies to B2C software. It doesn't apply anywhere else. And I have to say if I look at my client list right now, almost none of the companies are software. It's doing this in other industries. And I had the opportunity to interview one of the founders of Citizen M for my book, and they kind of prototyped a whole hotel in a way, or prototyped, using shipping containers to do the room design and everything. And he had moved on to doing it's like a long stay, business traveler friendly modular unit. And he was prototyping it, and he was not just testing it with travelers, but he was also testing it with cleaning people, because he realized, well, if it's really expensive to clean, this is still going to fail, because even if people want to pay to stay here, but they can't clean it, it's going to fail for that reason. So I thought that was very insightful from him. But I do think the word needs to get out more often that this isn't just a software thing where you're A/B testing and that's what experimentation is. I do think that's the trend right now. If we say experiment, people think, well, that's an A/B test. It's like, no, there's so many more things beyond A/B tests you could do. And you don't have to just be limited to software. I mean, whatever you're working on, be creative and find a way to test it to see if there's any demand whatsoever.
That's right. So you start with the biggest assumptions and then you move on. Like one example with Google Glass. So I was there at the time, right, when it was launched. And people say, that's an example. Why didn't they prototype it? They said, well, actually, Google, because, they have hundreds of billions of dollars, for them, it was just like, for me, investing $20 to try and read the book if I like it. So it was really nothing. It was never mass produced. And in fact, what they were actually trying to figure out remember that the Glass Explorer program, right? So, so you had to pay $1,000, you had to sign up. It was never mass produced, unlike the Apple Vision Pro, right? So that one, they spent a lot of time building, it was in the stores. They probably, have tens of hundreds of thousands of them built. It was never like that with Google Glass. They learned, there is some desirability, people like it, but then the desirability was offset, if you remember, by the fact that people didn't like other people looking at them with Google glasses because they looked a little creepy. So as you said, you learn second order effects, just like cleaning the containers, that in the end are going to harm the success of the product. So you go from one assumption to the other. And what I've discovered, David, is that if you have a lot of desirability, people will put up with a lot of missing feature, of problems. Right? I remember the first iPhone didn't even have cut and paste. It had a lot of issue, but it was so desirable that people did not care. And if you look at the history of a lot of products, their first version is terrible, but it's or expensive, big, bulky, like the VCRs or the first video recorded, but they're so desirable that people, if they want it enough, they will succeed. So desirability really is a tailwind for success. And if it's strong enough, it can overcome a lot of other issues. If it's not strong enough, right, it's going to kill you.
I agree. It's really tough, especially these companies that build something and then it's almost like they frantically look for a customer to sell it to. And you either find one before you run out of money or you don't. And it's such a stressful place to be. I mean, you have this runway and you're frantically looking for any signal. I feel as if we're kind of flipping that on its head a bit and saying, no, let's start with, the desirability and then back our way into what we build. And what we build may not have to be perfect. We can be a little embarrassed by what we build. So I'm really curious, you've done so much, and this is our first time really sitting down and chatting together. What's exciting you right now? I mean, I know I've seen you pulled into different things, AI related. I think I may have even seen an AI version of you out there somewhere. There's all kinds of stuff going on. Like, what gets excited? Like, what gets you excited about some of the, hypotheses you're testing now?
I've always been about testing. So right now I'm shifting from, product market fit to human being, kind of philosophy fit. So my next book is really a departure, right? It's called The Right You. And it's about my, I like to read I like to read a lot. So over the past 20 years, I've read, hundreds of books on, philosophy, psychology. Here's the progression. Building products right. So that was my focus on testing, engineering, design, design excellence, all those things. Then I realized, boy, I can build perfect product, but there is no market for them. So I shifted my focus on building the right product. And now I see a lot of people that have achieved the success with the market and all those things, but their lives are still miserable. So I'm tackling, I'm kind of turning 65, actually just a few days ago. So it's time for me to get serious and start tackling some of the bigger questions. And I feel that now I've lived long enough that I'm qualified to do something a bit more serious. So that's what excites me now, because I think, as you probably know, we live in the greatest, in one of the biggest time in terms of affluence and, all the major problems, kind of, at least for us over here, are resolved. And yet still there is a lot of unhappiness and, ennui and boredom and problems, and people arguing and fighting with each other. So I think now it's time for, Alberto to work on a slightly bigger problem. But of course, I still get really excited when I talk about Pretotyping, as you can tell, or innovation, especially now with AI. As you probably know, with AI, building prototypes with AI is so easy, right? One of the prototype techniques is the YouTube, where you have to kind of get a studio, pretend that your product exists, mock it up. Now you can just ask AI to do it. So it's great to be to prototype. Of course, there is a lot of risk in that too, but that's also exciting. But I want to focus more on kind of going to the next level, and work on the human psychology. Now that we got the software and the hardware and those things done, what about our wetware? Still needs some testing.
Yeah, we definitely have some bugs that we need to address. Can you give us any insights into it? Like, how would you begin to test? Because you've already written a pretty successful book and you've tested your way through it. What's a big assumption you want to test with this new book or some of a piece of it?
Right. So yeah. So by the way, I'm not here pitching it because I'm still writing. I have about a third. I get distracted because I'm trying to write as a book. When you write a book, anything will serve as a distraction, right? Kind of to procrastinate, right? So I have these clients that come back and say, "Yeah, Alberto, can you help us test this? We want to innovate." And I get all excited. I say, "Yeah, I'll do that." But yes, I'm following the playbook. So I have my own very hard metrics of skin in the game, right? So that's one of the key things. It's easier for people to open their mouth than to open their wallet. So I think the evidence that you must ask must come with some skin in the game. So skin in the game can be money. People can pre-order the product, put a deposit, give you some information like their email or your phone number. Or in the case of the book, the skin in the game is, will people read it, right? Because I bought many books, right? And I read 10, 20 pages, and then I let it go. I say, well, okay, $20 spent on the book are not worth, 4 hours of my time. So I'm prototyping. So I wrote the first part of the book. So let's say 90 pages out of 250 pages or so. So I put in a PDF format, in a Kindle format. And then I picked 20 people initially, friends, even people I met on LinkedIn that's, they seem interested. Hey, would you like to read it? And then my metric for them was, one, do they read to the end? And I know because, when I talked to them, I said, so what do you think of that? One of the characters called Marcus. So what do you think, what happened when Marcus jumped in the pond? And so I know that if they read to that point, said, yeah, I thought that scene was a little bit extreme or wasn't believable, or say, oh, that was great. So that's the first sign. If they read through, I told them, if you don't feel like reading, don't, because that data is not useful to me. And then the next one is, how much are they bugging me to keep writing the following part? So that's how I'm prototyping the book and kind of getting my data.
That's amazing. I love that. I have so many unfinished books. There was one a long time ago I started testing. It was like a business narrative sort of style. I found it incredibly challenging to do. It was almost easier to write testing business ideas than try to do that style of book because I was trying to test a chapter at a time. It was really hard to keep going. It was really hard to give feedback, to tie all the characters together. Because then you're functioning like as a proper novelist, I guess, and not just tinkering with. It's so easy for me. I won't say it's easy to write a book, but when you have experience, it's almost like, can I write a book like I'm coaching a team and what advice would I give them in this situation? That comes pretty naturally to me. But writing in a different style, it's quite challenging to test your way through that style, in my opinion.
Absolutely, yes. Now, having said, we talked about this testing desirability and everything. I think there's something important that both you and I need to tell, our students and our clients. Sometimes ignore everything we say. Why? Because I don't want to live in the world where the only products and things that are built are things that are kind of fully tested and vetted and guaranteed to succeed, right? You're not only allowed to get crazy once in a while. I want to live in a world where I say, I could tell to you, David, I'm going to write a book about squirrel watching, and I don't care if it sells a copy. I'm just so passionate about squirrel watching. I'm going to do it. And I think the world needs people like that. But especially if you get money from the VCs and you have, let alone your friends and family that want to invest in your business, then you really need to make sure that you're building the right it. But if you're not putting your other people's money and lives, at risk, I hope you do something crazy without, testing desirability, feasibility, or viability first. I'm just going to do something crazy. So I don't want to live in a world where there aren't people that take these crazy chances, like the Wright brothers. We need those. Just be very clear. I'm doing it because I want to make sure I succeed. And the other one said, I'm doing just because I want this thing to exist and I don't care if it works or not or if anybody buys it.
That's a great point. I like that. That's a great place, I think, to wrap up our conversation. So I love that you took time out of your busy day to hang out with me. I've been looking forward to this chat all week. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
I would say just go on LinkedIn, Alberto Savoia, and ideally you say, "Hey, Alberto, I like your work," so I don't know you're trying to spam me and try to sell me something with the next message. But yeah, please reach out. I also have a lot of YouTube videos. During COVID, I couldn't teach in person, so I started to record a lot of videos because you can only fit so much material in a book. And I hope I get some people, if anybody listens to this and you like a little math, that you're not afraid of it. It's like 5% of the people I talk to. I have a lot of great material for people who can tolerate a little math. And I don't put it in my book because I know that it really lowers the desirability. But there is a real science and math and logic and Bayesian thinking behind what David and I teach, right? Essentially, that's what we're teaching, right? There is the base assumption is that most ideas fails in the market. So when you do a test to get additional evidence to see if your probability of success is actually higher than the baseline probability, which is, 90% probability of failure. That's why we test. And what we're doing can be put into numbers. I like to say it with numbers, like in the Bayesian framework. So we're doing it without numbers because people prefer that, but that's my passion. So look for Alberto Savoia on LinkedIn. And if you listen to this because you know me and you do not know David, looked up David on LinkedIn because we are part of the same team. Yeah, so it's great. I was also looking forward to talking with you. Actually, I invited myself. I get a lot of requests to be on podcast, right? I said, hey, I should be in your podcast. After I heard the podcast with Patrick Copeland, I thought, Dave and I should also talk. So I kind of say, hey, will you invite me? And I'm glad it came out.
It was an easy yes on my part. Well, thank you so much, Alberto, for hanging out with me. Like I said, if you're not afraid of math and you want to reach out to Alberto, we'll also put those links on the page. Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you, David. And good luck to everybody out there coming up with new products.
Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.